Thank you so much for coming. My name is Lynn Eaton. I'm the Director of the Special Collections Research Center here at George Mason University, and I'm really excited that you all are here to be a part of our discussion about the Cuban Missile Crisis. On behalf of John Zanellis, who's the Dean of Libraries and University Librarian, and the other library faculty and staff, we wish to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to the Berkshire Lifelong Learning Institute, or OLLI, for their very generous special project grant award to the university libraries last spring. This afternoon's panel discussion is one prominent example of such special projects that this OLLI gift enables the library to organize and present to the George Mason University community. Thank you too to OLLI's Executive Director, Jennifer DeSano, for her excitement and interest in working with us on this project. She worked with the OLLI community to identify the veterans who are part of this panel, and we look forward to more collaborations in the future, I hope. I also wanted to thank Kathleen Kehoe, the Director of Development, and Jessica Clark, our Development and Communications Officer, for their support for this project in marketing and in the handouts and refreshments. We all really appreciate their work on that. You'll notice we have a video camera in the room pointed at me right now. That's the work of Bob Persell, the Special Collections Digital Collections Archivist, and Tiffany Cager-Wright, the Special Collections Oral History Intern. And they are taping this event for inclusion in our archival collection. So thank you, Bob and Tiffany, for your work getting all of these things together. After this event and more refreshments, I encourage you all to come visit the Special Collections Research Center. We have a display out of a few items from the Cuban Missile Crisis time period, or books about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I want to thank my entire staff, all of my staff, including the interns and the students, for all the work, their research, and setting up the materials. Really a good team effort. So the way the afternoon is going to go, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Professor Marty Sherwin, and then he's going to introduce the rest of the group. We're going to have them talk about their experiences. They're going to answer, I guess, some questions for Marty, and then we'll be opening it up for Q&A at the end. And please feel free at that point to jump on in. We have this microphone, and I'll be walking around. And when you have a question, we want to make sure it gets onto the videotape. So just wait a minute, and I'll just run over and give you the microphone to ask your questions. Okay, so Marty Sherwin. Professor Marty Sherwin is University Professor of History at George Mason University. He joined the faculties of the History and Art History Department and the School of Public Policy in the fall of 2007. For 27 years prior to coming to Mason, he was the Walter S. Dixon Professor of English and American History at Tufts University. His 2005 book, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, with Kai Bird, won the 2006 Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography, as well as the English Speaking Union Book Award, among other awards. Professor Sherwin is also the author of A World Destroyed, The Atomic Bomb and the Grand Alliance. This won the Bernath Prize awarded by the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, as well as the American History Book Prize awarded by the National Historical Society. It was a 1976 finalist for both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. Often referred to as a classic, it has been in print continuously for 40 years. He's currently writing a book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, titled Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to Havana, 1945 to 1963. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Professor Sherwin was the Air Intelligence Officer stationed at the Naval Air Station North Island in Coronado, California. Our panel, Bob Persell, Garrett Cochran, and Ray Beery, all served in different areas of the government. Mr. Persell with the U.S. Navy, Mr. Cochran with the CIA, and Mr. Beery with the Air Force. And as I said, I'll leave the more formal introductions to Professor Sherwin, but all four of these men experienced the same event through very different eyes, and I'm really looking forward to hearing that collective experience described here. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, for that introduction, which she took off my mother's website. I'm not going to give a formal introduction to the panel. I'm going to give a very informal introduction and let the panel introduce themselves. But Bob Persell, at the end, was an ensign on the USS Hank, destroyer during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Garrett Cochran, next in the middle, was on the analytic side of the CIA. And Ray Beery was in the Air Force, a captain, I believe, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was a lieutenant in the Navy. I think what I'll do to start things off is just give a very brief overview of background of the origins of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course began, for our purposes at least, with Castro's revolution, successful revolution in January 1959, when he chased Batista out of Cuba after several years of active resistance against him in the mountains of Cuba. By 1961, January 61, just before the inauguration of President Kennedy, President Eisenhower broke relations with Cuba, suspecting Castro of being far too left and of being a communist, although I doubt very much if Castro was a communist at that point, but there were lots of communists in the Castro government. By late 1961, Cuba and the Soviet Union had begun to embrace each other, and in April of 1961, with the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, backed by the United States government, the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs, Castro and the Soviet Union became each other's new best friends. By the spring of 1962, about a year later, Khrushchev was deeply worried that the United States was going to make up for the Bay of Pigs and do it right, so to speak, with a full-scale invasion. There were lots of indications that this was in the cards, and he began to worry that if he failed to protect his new best friend, his opportunities to continue to infiltrate, to make new best friends in Latin America would completely disappear. And also, this was a time when the Soviet Union and China were beginning to have very serious differences, and Mao was challenging Khrushchev for the leadership of the communist bloc. And it was Mao's argument that Khrushchev was a revisionist. This stuff of peaceful coexistence was nonsense. What you needed was world revolution. And there were, Khrushchev knew, a fairly significant group of Maoists within the Castro government. Che Guevara, for one. He suspected Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, as being another. What can I do, Khrushchev thought, to protect Cuba? Brilliant idea. The United States had stationed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and in Italy. The missiles in Turkey were about 130 miles from 150 miles from Khrushchev's dacha. And he decided, well, if the United States can do that to me, I can do the same thing to the United States. And I think it would be a good idea to sneak my missiles into Cuba, and once those missiles are ready to fire, there's no chance that the United States would invade Cuba. So not only will I protect Cuba, but I will pull off this brilliant scheme, And I will also close the missile gap, because the United States was well ahead of the Soviet Union in missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles and other missiles too. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis was born, and Khrushchev began the process, or the Soviet Union began the process in June, July of 1962, of moving 43,000 troops to Cuba in the holds of Soviet ships. Some of those areas where Soviet troops were bunking got to 112, 114 degrees Fahrenheit, the closer they got to Cuba. A lot of the Soviet troops died, and they were buried at sea. It was an extraordinary movement of troops. Not only 43,000 troops, but also tanks, and those missiles, and the nuclear warheads, and tactical nuclear weapons. We believe during the Cuban Missile Crisis that there were about 11,000 Soviet troops on Cuba. There were 43,000, as I said. We knew that the tactical missiles were there, but we did not, some of them, we did not believe that they had nuclear warheads on them, and they did. And those tactical weapons would be used against American troops if we invaded, and against American ships if they came within 25 miles of Cuba. Now, none of us here knew about any of this until October 22nd, 1962, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when the president came on television and radio and made his famous 20-minute address. But the president had known about these missiles since October 16th. So there were really two Cuban Missile Crises. The first was the one that the president and his advisors and the military, senior military people, and CIA, of course, knew about between October 16th and October 22nd, and the public Cuban Missile Crisis, and the one that involved the Soviet Union, because they didn't know that we knew that our missiles were there between October 16th and 22nd. So we are all alerted on October 22nd to this event. And let me simply begin by asking Bob to tell us about what it was like when you heard the news as a young ensign on the destroyer USS Anchor.
Some of you may not be familiar with the rank of ensign, but it's the lowest.
Bob, could you talk directly? You kind of have to gobble the mic.
It's the lowest. Is this thing on? Hello? 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 It's the lowest commissioned rank in the United States Navy. So you're going to get a view from what I saw and from not being indoctrinated by any previous knowledge about what the hell was going on. I was on a Sumner-class destroyer. That's an old World War II destroyer that was still on service. I wasn't just an ensign, though. I was what we used to call, us ensigns used to call, fleet ensign. And if you'd been commissioned more than a year and you were at sea and you had qualified as an officer of the deck for fleet operations, then you could call yourself a fleet ensign. So I was a fleet ensign. And we were operating on routine training operations with the carrier Independence. Finished our operations for the day, went into Mayport, Florida, tied up, and had an overnight in Mayport. And the next morning we got underway for operations with the Independence, and out of the blue, the Independence took off on a course that sort of headed down towards Cuba, we didn't really know all that. They took off, they could make much more speed than we could, and they said, follow us. Now, about this time, my wife back in Norfolk was wondering, well, where's Bob and when are they coming back? And so she called the captain's wife. And the captain's wife said, Beverly, turn on your television and President Kennedy will tell you where your husband is.
So just to be clear, the carrier took off before the speech, and you followed in pursuit of the carrier.
Yeah, so we didn't really know exactly what was going on, but somehow the Wise Network knew what was going on. We were assigned to the quarantine line, and that was a 500-mile arc from the tip of the eastern tip of Florida, an arc, and then we were supposed to intercept ships at that distance because they hadn't quite gotten there yet. And we were really in, the United States Navy used to do board and search with sailing ships 100 and some years before, but we were trained to chase submarines and shoot shore bombardment and fire at other ships, find submarines, whatever. But it's important for you to keep in mind the fact that there's a difference between the term quarantine and blockade. And the term blockade and the establishment of a blockade, Lincoln went through this too. Blockade is an act of war. It's also, from Lincoln's point of view, it would have been a recognition of the status of the Confederates as a state. So they were still starting to use the term blockade, and then everybody said, I know, we won't have a blockade, we'll have a quarantine. So we had a quarantine, but we thought it was a blockade. Things that we did different than normal routine stuff was port and starboard watches. We manned the gun 24 hours a day. As an ensign, my position was in the after gun director because that only required 2 people. And we had a 3-inch 50 twin mount, which required a much smaller crew than the 5-inch 38 gun mounts. There's much smaller artillery, if you will. So I was assigned to this aft director, which was right behind 2 smokestacks. And as the ship steams, unless there's a good wind coming in from the quarter or something, all that stack gas comes back there. So that was one of my memories of the blockade. We started to focus on, let me tell you one thing about my communications as the gun director was with the bridge by a sound-powered phone that only the bridge could call me and then I could respond, but I could not call the bridge. So having read a lot of World War I novels and Hornblower novels and things as a kid, I knew that some merchantmen would drop the sides of their hull and out would come an 8-inch cannon and start shooting at it. So it was dark one night, but I spotted this ship, and about that time, I got a call from the bridge. Hey, Bob, what are you doing? I said, I've got this target out here. Why didn't you call me about it? I've got the director on it, and the gun's an automatic. Bob, get that gun center line. Okay.
It was what, one of our ships?
It was an innocent merchantman.
Okay.
So that curbed my enthusiasm for harking back.
If I can interrupt for a moment, just to underline that, it's an interesting story because one of the questions about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how dangerous was it in terms of the possibility of going to war or something happening. Now, neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy wanted a nuclear war or wanted any kind of war because it would clearly possibly lead to a nuclear war. But there were all kinds of things that were happening out there that they had no control over. And this kind of event, I mean, it happened to be a merchant ship, but, you know, it was,
Well, I wasn't
you know,
stupid. I wasn't going to shoot without the bridge's permission.
right, yeah, right, but you never can tell. I mean, you're a sensible guy, but maybe if I was there and I wasn't so sensible, I would have shot. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, one of the things that we had to do, because we hadn't done it before, was to focus on the visit and search process. And we really didn't have a lot of guidance, and the experience was, you know, decades, century ago, pretty much. And so one of the things we had to do was put together a boarding party, and that would require our motor whale-boat to be manned up. And there's a bill that said what people needed to be on that boarding party. And the XO was the boarding officer, and a junior officer from the weapons department would be the junior officer. And the weapons, the XO would carry a pistol, and the junior officer would carry a pistol. I said, no, I'm taking a Thompson submachine gun. And the XO approved of that. He thought that was a very good idea. And on a pleasant evening one night, we fortunately never had to call this bill away, but pleasant evening one night, the gunner's mate on the boat, on the motor whale-boat crew, was talking up on the wing of the bridge with the CO and myself. And he said, I don't know if I could really shoot somebody face to face. So after he left, CO and I said, we got to replace that guy, because we didn't want to have our lives depend on somebody who was hesitant to shoot. So that was the extent of my lovely adventures. The blockade was a huge success, but it was a massive effort. There were at least 102 destroyers that were involved. The first quarantine line was 15 destroyers, and we were one of those 15. And then they put in a second quarantine line, and there were 22 ships in that one. So the rest of the destroyers were relieving, coming back and forth, and a whole bunch of other support ships, LSTs, oilers, you name it. So it was a pretty massive effort that they ginned up in pretty much of a hurry. I thought the early exercises with the independents were in the know, that they just wanted to get a lot of ships positioned down there. Garrett told me that wasn't true. I think that's what you told me.
I don't remember.
In any event, it took a lot of
Typical CIA
ships. It took a lot of intelligence efforts. It took a lot of Air Force efforts. It took a lot of ASW submarine work to be going on. Probably the most dangerous part was submarines, because if a Soviet submarine thinks it's under attack, he might have had somebody who was going to defend the ship, and that fortunately did not occur.
Actually, it almost occurred. We'll talk about that afterwards when we go through.
So,
Well, I'll come back to you, Bob. Garrett,
Okay.
from the CIA, could you use a microphone, please?
I graduated from college in 1956 with a degree in chemical engineering, which has significance to what follows. And I immediately went on to graduate school and had a master's degree in industrial management in 1958. I was hired off the campus by CIA to work in the analysis part of the agency in what then was called the Office of Research and Reports. And my job involved following the chemical industries of the Soviet Union and satellite, and particularly the contribution to the Soviet economy and their contributions to the Soviet military effort. Let me see. And after 6 months, after only 6 months, I had a military commitment, so went into the Army. So I got all these highfalutin guys on either side of me. Private Cochran served for 2 years in the U.S. Army, and then went back to my job in the agency.
Where did you serve in the Army?
I served Fort Jackson, Fort Chaffee, then research and development at Fort Belvoir, and my second year in the Army Chemical Corps Intelligence Agency at Arlington Hall Station. Which, I'm surprised that any of you knew that. The National Security Agency had just moved out of there, and I went in. That was a wonderful experience. If you want to know anything about chemical warfare, I'm the guy. Okay, I went back to the agency. There was a military research area in Office of Research and Report, and I was a liaison between our group and their group, particularly on the subjects of missile propellants. Propellant is a fancy word. Most liquid propellant missiles have two different liquids, a fuel and the oxidizer. They, in fact, make up, for a liquid propellant missile, they make up about 90% of the weight of the missile. So they're not trivial little things like fuel in your gas tank. So the missile people, as far as I knew, did not know exactly what the propellants were that the Soviet missiles being tested at that time were using. So I was trying to identify plants in the Soviet Union that were producing those propellants to get a leg up on what those propellants were. So to make a long story short, I had a relationship with the Guided Missiles Task Force that would in fact play a critical role in the missile crisis.
Now, Bob, excuse me, Garrett, you said in your write-up that the day after President Kennedy's speech, one of the military analysts came to me with some questions. What I will address is what those questions were. And I think you're coming to that. Yes?
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
I remember what I told you. Starting about June or July, the missile people started calling me in Soviet ships going to Cuba. And they were very concerned. I've read that the U.S. had no idea that things were happening, etc. That's nonsense. They would call me in and say, see this picture, see this photograph, do you recognize anything in that photograph that might be related to fuel technology or to missiles in any way? I failed my country in the sense that I never found a single thing. but that cemented my relationship with these people who were the primary followers of the Soviet program. So we had, on October 22nd, that memorable speech. I went in to my office the next day, and we all knew, I knew even a month or two before, a certain tenseness in the air, although my group was not directly involved in what became the missile crisis. You just knew that something was going on. So the next day, was in the afternoon about 1:30. One of the missile guys I worked with came in and sat down beside me, and he said quietly, "We just had a call from the Navy, from the people who were instructing those people who were going to climb up on those ships and inspect them. When those young sailors climb up on those ships, just what are they supposed to be looking for?"
Good question.
Oh, came the response from CIA, "We'll get back to you." And as a consequence, one of the missile guys came over, he sat down beside me and said, "Assume that the oxidizer, one of the propellants, is red fuming nitric acid. When he goes up on that ship, will he be able to see red fuming nitric acid? No, that's what it is. That is the thing that we're looking for." I didn't know. So after, I said I'd get back to him, of course. After he left, I got together with my boss, and we came up with 3 questions. In the case of red fuming nitric acid, is it shipped in standard containers as opposed to something special? The second was, did it have some sort of valving arrangement because of its danger that would flag it as being red fuming the content? And the third was, would it have to be shipped above deck, or could it be shipped below? You ship things above deck if they're so dangerous, if the container leaks, you let the wind blow it away, so that's important. I did not know the answers to those 3 questions that we had put together, but I got on my secure telephone and made a phone call. By 5 o'clock, I had 5 answers from 4 different U.S. chemical companies.
They were what? DuPont, surely?
I don't remember. They were major producers of that, and I knew that because in my job I had to keep up on what was going on in the chemical industry. So I read U.S. Chemical journals and things like that, and we had reference documents and so on. So I made the phone call, and by 5 o'clock I had 5 answers from 4 different U.S. chemical companies. And the answer was it could be shipped in standard containers. It did not have to be shipped on the deck, and there were no special valving or safety arrangements to it. Of course, I got that back to Bob, and that was that. Then another question came up. A U.S. chemical company had built a nitrogen fertilizer plant in Cuba. It opened about 1958. It was a pretty new plant. So my missile buddies wanted to know, did that plant use red fuming nitric acid in making nitrogen fertilizer? And the second question was, if it did not, could it be easily converted to produce red fuming nitric acid? And so I got on my secure phone, and that was maybe 5:30 at night, that night on the night of the 23rd. And I went home about 7 or 8 o'clock. We were all working very long hours and stuff. When I got home in my bachelor apartment, I was only there about 15, 20 minutes, and the phone rang. This is so-and-so who I didn't know. And he said, I just talked to such and so at such and so company. I didn't know anything about it. And the answer to both questions is no. That the plant did not produce red fuming nitric acid, nor could it be easily converted to do so. Okay? And then I said, well, given the importance of this person that you talked to, is he confident that he knows the capability of the plant? There was a silence on the phone. Then he designed it. Let me say about CIA, that part of CIA really worked. Let me, let Ray, I'll come back to some things.
Okay, good. Okay, Ray Beery was a Air Force captain during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what'd you do?
Okay. This was very real for me, the Cuban Missile Crisis. My station at that time was Fort Lee, Virginia, Petersburg, Virginia. And we learned as soon as the crisis developed that what the United States was facing was a potential threat from Soviet intermediate range ballistic missiles, SS-4. These were not the most advanced intermediate range ballistic missiles the Soviets had. They had the SS-5, but that was not here. The SS-4, however, we learned very quickly, had a range that would reach Baltimore. So very definitely Petersburg, Virginia was a target. What was my job? My job at this time, 1962 in the Air Force, is in the broader context of the Cold War. What was the U.S. Air Force doing in the Cold War in those years? We were preparing to attack the Soviet Union and China with bombers, primarily bombers. The Strategic Air Command had 1,000 bombers, give or take 20 or 30, in B-52s, B-47s, B-58s. Those crews on those bombers were on a wartime status every day. When the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, other parts of the military had to increase their alert status and do other things. The Strategic Air Command was all ready to do what it was going to do. However, whatever plans SAC had for going to Cuba were not very well known across the command, if they existed at all. The Strategic Air Command was looking north. We wanted to go across the North Pole when ordered to do so and bomb the Soviet Union.
Were you, can I interrupt for a minute and just ask, were you a pilot, navigator,
Okay,
bombardier?
thank you very much.
And what kind of plane?
I was not a flyer. I was not a pilot. I was very closely related to many of the pilots and air crews over all the years of my service. I was trained as a communications officer in the Air Force out of college, ROTC, in 1957. And I went to my first Cold War assignment in France on a base where we had medium-range bombers with nuclear weapons. And my job was to take care of the flying activities. We ran the control tower, we ran radars, and we kept them flying. So that was a Cold War activity. Following that, I came back to what I wanted to describe as the second act of what the U.S. Air Force was doing during the Cold War, and that was the flip side of bombing the Soviet Union. We had to protect our nation from the Soviet bombers. They didn't have 1,000, they had maybe 150. Bears and bisons, they were called, but they were very capable. Over many years, what these two forces did, Strategic Air Command looking at the Soviets, long-range Soviet aviation looking at the United States Air Defense Command, equipped with many interceptor airplanes, looking to shoot down the bombers and the converse in the Soviet Union. So my second job was in air defense. This country spent many billions of dollars building a very advanced air defense system which was deployed beginning in 1959. It was called SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, and it's of interest to young techies today because it was all electronic. Computer-controlled information, command centers, inputs from radar sites, tracking the skies. We were watching for that attack from the north. My job, having been trained in depth by IBM in their most advanced computers, my job was to run the computers in air defense. Across the country, there were a little over 20 regions for air defense. Each region had a headquarters, which was a concrete blockhouse, blast resistant, and that's where we placed the computers. The tentacles reaching out from these computer centers were to radar sites where we scanned the skies and to interceptor airplanes where we talked with the air crews who were getting ready to go and fight. So I was in air defense, running the computers, a very essential activity if we were going to defend the country. Just like the Strategic Air Command, being on alert all the time, we were too in Air Defense Command. So with relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we heard about it, what kind of orders did we get? Number one, continue doing what you're doing. You're on alert, be ready for the Soviet bombers that are coming across the North Pole. We wanted to look south, what's happening down there in Cuba. We were not very well equipped. The whole Air Defense Command was not very well equipped to do anything in that direction. The other command of the Air Force that I did not mention yet was called the Tactical Air Command. These were the fighters and fighter bombers which went into close combat whenever called upon. And that not only fighter bombers, but they had reconnaissance airplanes. And these, through the Tactical Air Command of the United States Air Force, were pressed into service very quickly in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they flew over Cuba on order. One of those airplanes, a U-2, high-flying reconnaissance airplane, was shot down, the pilot killed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only thing that happened in my unit that was different during the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of my colleagues was away from home station attending a professional military school, the Air Force's Squadron Officer School, for four months. He was called back. They closed that school, called him back to get ready for whatever, we didn't know. I was concerned because I was scheduled to go to that same school next. And I hoped the crisis would be over quickly because I didn't want to miss that opportunity. It was over. I didn't miss my opportunity. I had a good time doing that. So that, we were concerned as a family, as a military unit, because we realized we were under threat. We felt a lot more tense than we had before during this crisis. We were glued to the televisions to see what the president was going to tell us next. We were very well aware of the naval quarantine. If we ever thought about it, knew that the CIA was doing the think stuff that was necessary, gathering information and putting it in the right hands. So that was my participation.
Okay, thank you very much. So now for my participation. I was the Air Intelligence Officer in VP 31. That was an anti-submarine warfare training patrol squadron stationed in Naval Air Station, North Island, which is just off San Diego, Coronado, California. A beautiful, beautiful place. And being the Air Intelligence Officer, I was the guy who kept the top secret squadron orders. Big safe in my office, and then a little safe inside this very big safe, where every 6 months, some lieutenant commander from the Fleet Air Command would come over with Marine guards with an envelope, the new orders. Give me the envelope. I'd very nervously open up the safe, because if those top secret orders weren't in there where I'd last put them, I was headed for Navy prison. Open up the safe, take out the orders. I'd sign for the new orders. He'd sign for the orders I gave him when in the safe. And we never expected to see what was in those orders. We used to joke they were clippings from the New York Times. But on October 22nd, I found out what was in those orders. I received a telephone call from Fleet Headquarters. Marine guards came over and marched me over to the skipper's office, where the captain, the XO, and the operations officer had gathered. And I had the top secret orders, which I opened up and read to them. And it turned out we were going to deploy to Baja, California. None of us had been in Baja, California. Being junior officers and a little, I don't know, flaky, I suppose, or maybe extra nervous when all of this was a day or two later, public among the squadron said, "Gee, Baja, California, what a great place to die." Well, I said, I think I introduced the fact that I was writing a book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I didn't know how close we had come until I started to research that book. It was an extraordinary experience, and I'd like to ask each of you, your personal feelings about it, how it felt during the crisis. But for me, I look back at it, and I'm quite embarrassed because knowing now what I know, I look back at this young, actually I think I said I was a lieutenant. I was a Lieutenant JG at the time. We weren't nervous or scared at all. We were kind of doing we were all excited. I mean, this was, you know, hey, finally, something's happening. And, you know, there was all sorts of ordnance being brought onto the base that we had never seen before. And I don't even remember calling my parents to tell them that I'm okay. I was just doing my job. I was working, and you know, we were going along, working, I don't know, 16, 17 hours a day, and I can't even tell you now what we were doing during those 16, 17 hours, but we were getting ready for something that we didn't know, and we didn't know what. It was a very, very strange period. We never did deploy. The crisis, fortunately, never came to the point where we started shooting at each other, although on Saturday, October 27th, the day before the crisis ended, as Ray pointed out, Major Anderson, the pilot of a U-2 plane over Cuba, was shot down by an unauthorized shoot down by a Soviet missile, surface-to-air missile, the same missile system that had shot down Gary Powers on April 1st, 1960. So that was my experience, and I'd like to, you know, Bob,
Let me
go ahead.
jump in with something, because two things that you mentioned and Ray mentioned. The Anderson flight is what I want to zero in on. My boss in my job in the chemicals branch spent a year at the National War College. And when he came back, he talked about some of the things that happened. And he mentioned an exercise that he was involved in, where half the war team was red team and half the other half was the blue team. And they were in Germany, and the event happened.
And this is a war game that they played.
War game. Of course, the instructors are doing the war game and stuff. And so the red team would do this, and the blue team would respond this way. And the red team would respond to the blue team's response, etc. In the case of Al's group, they wound up shooting all their missiles at each other. And after the event was over, the instructors told them, every year it's the same. that everybody winds up shooting all its missiles. And I remember saying back, so thanks, Al. What other good news do you have? And then, by chance, I read in a French newspaper that in the French War College, they did the same thing, and they always got the same answer. Everybody winds up shooting at one another. Okay. Now, in the Cuban Missile Crisis on the 23rd, etc., I didn't think that the U.S. or the Soviets wanted World War III. But things happen, and they get out of control. That Saturday, the Anderson U-2 was shot down over Cuba. And I said to myself, this is step one. The U.S. is going to come up with step 2, with step 3, and step 4. Whoa. I went back to my office after I learned about that, which was early afternoon. It was a beautiful fall day. And I looked out at the hillside behind my office. The trees had all turned. It was magnificent. And I asked myself whether I would ever see another one.
That's interesting because it's exactly the same thing that Robert McNamara
Yes.
says in the film The
Yeah,
Fog of War.
and I read that years later, and I said, well, McNamara and I are on the same page.
I think a lot of people thought that.
Well,
Then I must be wrong, is what he
fortunately, the president was not on the same page, and the arrangement that he had made with the Joint Chiefs of Staff was that if any American plane was shot down, he would authorize that the missile or the gun emplacement site that had shot it down would be bombed. And he went back on his word. He thought that there was some kind of closure coming to, remember this is Saturday, the day 27th, the crisis ends on Sunday the 28th, and he could feel that there was an arrangement that was moving into place with Khrushchev, and he thought that if he followed through on his promise to the Joint Chiefs and bombed that missile site, that it would, in effect, blow up the final arrangement. And he was right. And so he held his powder, so to speak, and the next morning, Washington time, I think 4 o'clock Moscow time, Khrushchev had an announcement over Radio Moscow saying that he accepted the president's pledge that the United States would not invade Cuba, and he would remove the missiles from Cuba. There was, of course, a secret agreement that we only learned about many decades later, that the United States would take the Cuban missiles out of Turkey, and within several months, and they came out within 2 months. So, Bob, how did it feel on that ship? I mean, were you as
Exactly the same way you were reacting.
Yeah.
We were busy enough with our daily activities, and I've always said, we don't make the wars, the military, we fight the wars that the politicians have made. And that's the way it's supposed to be in a democracy. And so we had a job to do, and we were doing our job, and not spending a lot of time worrying about the consequences of what could be happening, but dealing with what we were doing.
Now you were on the blockade/quarantine line. Unlike me, I was out there in California. So you were right on top of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so to speak. Do you remember any conversations with your fellow officers about, gee, you think this thing's going to blow up or whatever?
No.
All right. I think that says a lot, actually. How young people, why it's so easy to get young people to go to war.
Yeah.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yes, yes. So Ray, how about
I alluded to this earlier. We were on alert all the time against a certain threat. Now we had a new threat against the nation, but our particular job hadn't changed. We were nervous, and we were living there with our families, and we thought, as we talked to each other, this may turn into a war. There may be missiles exploding here in Virginia.
well, where, I know I can picture where Bob is on this destroyer, and we know that Garrett was a bachelor at the time, and he was going back and forth from his office to his apartment. What exactly, were you doing?
Okay, I worked in this protected blockhouse, 40-hour week. I was responsible for a group of technicians who were working on shifts, and they were working, we filled those positions around the clock. I lived with my young family in post housing on Fort Lee, Virginia.
So did your wife, what did you talk about with her? I mean, you're the one who had this responsible relationship, and there was a possibility of war, and you had a young family.
I had been in the military for 10 years at this time, and this was my campaign number 3 of the Cold War. My wife and first child had been with me on campaign number 2 in France, and we had the same threat more or less all the time. Now I'm rambling here because I don't recall anything that was very much different. There were 2 other times during the Cold War in my military career where things were considerably more tense. I was in Vietnam for a year, and I suffered under the attacks of rockets and mortars, and I was a commander of a Minuteman missile unit with my finger on the nuclear trigger, ready to blow up the Soviet Union that way. And in that case,
I hope there was a key and another guy.
No, the 2 of us together. But it was not a blast-resistant blockhouse at that time. It was a completely blast-proof hole in the ground, well protected to take almost a direct strike. And that made us nervous, because if we had received a close call, we really felt that our elevator was going to be destroyed, and there was no way we'd ever get out of that hole. So there were tense periods during the Cold War, but the one campaign after another came along, and it was a great day for us Cold Warriors in 1989, when, for all intents and purposes, the Cold War was over.
We have four guys up here who were, one way or another, involved with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we've testified that we weren't nervous. Was there anybody who was nervous? And I'm going to tell you a story about someone who was very nervous. When you were a civilian just sitting out there, and if anybody would tell us your story, I'd appreciate it. But when you were a civilian, it was a very different point of view. And many, many years ago, when I taught at Tufts University, I taught a course called The Physics and History of the Nuclear Age, which I did in a partnership with a physicist at Tufts University, who go unnamed because you'll see why. And when I talked about the history of Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was built, he would talk about the next day the physics of how an atomic bomb was built. And that's the way people learn their physics and learn their history. So the course gets to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I give my lecture, and I tell my war story, which you've heard. And then it occurs to me that, let's call him John, the professor who's I'm teaching with, is sitting in the back of the room. We went to each other's lectures. I said, John, I remember that you were at the University of Chicago. He's a bit younger than me. You were at the University of Chicago during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You were a graduate student there. What was it like for you? And he says, oh my God, we were so incredibly scared. We were so scared that my girlfriend and I went to City Hall and got married. And I thought, yeah, I know his wife, and I said, gee, that's great, something good came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, oh no, 6 months later we got divorced. So people, who are out there, just watching this on television, had a very different point of view if they were paying attention than we apparently had. Garrett?
Yeah. I don't recall any particular conversations with most of my workmates or anything. A critical event that I remember, and that everyone in my office, you could hear the sighs of relief, was when a Soviet ship, the Poltava, was on its way to Cuba and was about to come up onto this guy's stuff. It turned around and went home. That was a critical event. We were talking about the ships and so on. On the day after the crisis, a friend of mine who worked on international maritime, CIA analyst working on international maritime, stopped in the office and he was practically shaking. And he wanted me to know something. They were getting calls from senior U.S. government officials wanting to know the political affiliations of Greek ship captains. They wanted to make sure that if they stopped a Greek ship, the captain wouldn't run down from the bridge and run them through with a giant sword. So
Right.
he didn't want to be responsible for World War III by misidentifying the political affiliations of such and such a captain.
Yeah, the reason for that is that the Soviets did not have enough ships for this enormous secret transfer of military personnel plus rockets and everything else. So they rented, essentially, they used a lot of their own ships, but they also used ships from Spain, from Greece, and others.
I don't know, but I don't suspect that the Greek ship would have been one that the Soviets had rented. It was the first ship to set the pattern, and that.
Well, yes, there were ships coming to Cuba that had nothing to do with the Soviets,
and the first one stopped was in that category.
Yeah, but the Soviets did have to rent.
Absolutely.
There were 80 ships involved in the operation. The name of the Soviet operation was Anadyr, A-N-A-D-Y-R, which was the name of a Soviet river in northern Siberia. And this name was given to the operation as a cover. And they not only gave it the name of a northern river, but they also ostentatiously issued skis and warm weather clothing to a lot of the troops to confirm that they were heading north. So when some of these troops landed in Cuba, they had their winter fur hats, and a lot of wool pants and wool shirts, and it was pretty miserable for a while till they got comfortable clothing. But there were 80 ships, and most of them made two voyages back and forth. So why don't we open the floor to questions, and when you have something to say, you must speak into the mic. Do not say a word before the microphone. Please identify yourself also.
My name's Skip Beal. I'm an Ollie member, a friend of Bob's and Garrett's, and now a friend of Ray's. I've been a member 5 years.
And you're a friend of mine, too.
And I'm a friend of yours. It's the first time I've met Ray, actually, since I've been a member for 5 years. I don't know how that happened. But at any rate, two observations. First of all, on what later became referred to as Black Saturday, the day that the U-2 was shot down. There were two other disparate incidents that could have caused a nuclear war. There was a U.S. reconnaissance plane that either flew or blew off course into Russia that could have been a problem. And then there were 3 or 4 Russian submarines that had nuclear-tipped torpedoes on them that could have been pretty nasty. But on a lighter note, I was a sophomore in high school during the missile crisis. And I was in English class. If I live to be 100, I'll never forget this. There was a gal next to me. I won't reveal her last name because it's kind of embarrassing, but her first name was Susan, and she turned to me and she said, you know, if I knew I was really going to die, I'd do all these wild things like smoke marijuana and have sex with boys. And I thought that was the craziest thing. And I attended my 50th reunion hoping to see her and catch her on that, but she wasn't there.
Well, that's the way my co-teacher John felt, and, you know, when got married.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. First, I would like to start.
Dave, identify yourself.
All right, my name is Dave. I'm a student of Dr. Sherwin's. Again, I would like to just start off by thanking you guys for coming down and speaking to us about your experiences. My question to you is, what is one lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis that you think is especially relevant to today?
I'm sorry.
A lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis that you think is especially relevant for today.
Oh, I don't have any trouble with that at all. The statesmanship demonstrated by John F. Kennedy is the lesson.
My lesson is get rid of nuclear weapons. Worldwide, everybody.
Because one way or another, something bad's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Bob? Yeah.
Well, there's an awful resemblance in some respects, between then and North Korea.
Yeah.
And we were fortunate in Cuba, and I really don't have a lesson except speak softly, and maybe you won't have to use the big stick.
The lesson that I would draw is that you've got to talk to the other guys who have these nasty weapons that are pointed at you. My class knows that Khrushchev and Kennedy had a very significant relationship before the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was one of the reasons Khrushchev was able to pull this off. Kennedy was duped by Khrushchev, essentially lied to. But instead of being as angry as he was in the first few hours finding out about the missiles in Cuba, Kennedy pulled it together, thought about the consequences of all of this, and continued to have a diplomatic relationship with Khrushchev. The first days after the October 22nd speech were rough. The letters that went back and forth were very hostile from Khrushchev, but things worked out within the following 48 hours. without the willingness to communicate, to talk to each other, to see if there were points where these two enemies could agree, we would not have resolved the crisis the way we did. And the situation today is very, very dangerous because we have virtually no relationship with North Korea. We do not have an embassy there. We do not seem to be talking to them. Our president has insulted Kim Jong-un in a way that makes it almost impossible for, given their culture, for him to have any kind of public agreement with President Trump, because it would be losing face, and so on and so forth. So we got to figure out how to get this on track, in my view. Others? Identify yourself.
My name is John, and I want to thank everybody for sharing your experiences. It's really been interesting. I just wanted to really quickly share a quick experience I had a few years ago. The Spy Museum here in DC was doing a Cuban Missile Crisis simulation, and they had somebody that had been a CIA analyst at the time talking, and in the audience was the ex-head of the KGB in the United States at that time. And after the event, I'm friends with people at the Spy Museum. We all went out for drinks, and these two mortal enemies were, sharing beers and laughing, and it was very interesting how the world has changed. But I was just wanted to echo your comments about today, and it's really frightening to imagine if any kind of crisis similar to this happened with our current president in charge.
Was that by any chance Feklisov, or the KGB guy, Alexander Fomin, or Feklisov, he had a nom de plume?
Can't remember his name. Kyrgyz, I think, something like that. Can't remember.
Okay.
Sorry.
Let me just add, the relationship of the Soviet and the EU, not at all surprising that they get together. That happens frequently.
I mean, think about World War II. The war against Nazi Germany was, pretty fierce, and the war against the Japanese was horrendously racist on both sides. We could not have hated an enemy any more than Americans hated the Japanese during the war, and the war was over, and a new relationship began to build almost immediately. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. If nuclear weapons had been used by both sides for the last year of the war, there would have been nothing left of anybody to patch up, relations. And I think that's why Garrett is saying we've got to get rid of nuclear weapons, because once they start being used, once the deterrence fails, we're all sunk and gone. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Stan, and I'm a Holly member, of course, friends of all these gentlemen. But one of the observations I was just making from listening is that, as Ray pointed out, we knew what kind of missiles they were. And as Gary pointed out, we really didn't know a hell of a lot about them. We had one way of looking, our U-2 planes, of course, identified some things, but our CIA, and I believe 60 years later, that's probably telling the whole truth, though I'm not sure, that they couldn't identify what was really there. And that's really scary, because you couldn't tell the Navy what to search for on the ships. And so that would be really scary, because we were in a situation where we really didn't have the details, and it was up to the diplomacy of our president to, sort of second guess. He had a little bit of information, and he really tried to second guess. And that seems to be where we are now in many of our world situations. Maybe you have a comment on that, Gary.
Depends on, you say, we didn't know. Depends on which we you're talking about. In fact, when that guy came over and said to me, red fuming nitric acid, I said to myself, whoa, how come he's so sure now? We knew everything about those missiles because we had a spy, Penkovsky. And Penkovsky provided the training manuals and how you set up a site or so on. So we were confident. We could tell the president on October 23rd, you have X days before these sites will be operational, because we knew where they were on the planning document. Now that doesn't always happen, but we, in fact, knew we needed. I don't think there was anything we needed to know that we didn't know in terms of the mechanics of what was going on. The politics, of course, is something different. Let me just say one other thing. There's a lot of bandying about nuclear weapons. This suggests under some circumstances the use of nuclear weapons is okay. Pakistan, for example, said in its relations with India, if the Indians do such and so, we have the nuclear weapons. There's a theory around that if you talk about nuclear weapons in any sense that makes them okay, you increase the probability that they in fact will be used. And so get them all off the table. I mean, all talk about them off the table.
Well, you mentioned the war games where both sides consistently over the years ended up using their nuclear weapons. Now, most of these war games that you were referencing, Garrett, were staffed by junior people. That is, the red and the blue teams were junior people. One of the interesting things is that some of the war games that I've looked into that was staffed by senior people, there was happily much less inclination, to use the weapons, because these were in fact the people who would probably be making the decisions, but that is only a very small consolation, I think, because it did not eliminate the use of nuclear weapons. Marty, identify yourself, please.
Pardon?
I said identify yourself.
My name is Marty Breeds. I'm an undergraduate student of Dr. Sherwin's, and I have a question for Mr. Persell. If somebody had decided to run that blockade, would you have shot knowing it could have led to World War III?
Here's what I would have done. First, we asked them to stop, and if they just ignore that and keep on going, you put a shot across the bow. Failing that, I would load the gun with training ammunition, which has no high explosive in it, just BL&P, bind, load, and plug, basically sand. And I would shoot for their rudder. And then I would send a boarding party over.
there was an interesting confrontation that's fairly well known if you read read books about the Cuban Missile Crisis, between Secretary of Defense McNamara and the Chief of Naval Operations Anderson. McNamara went down to Flag Plot one evening, I think it must have been the evening of the 23rd before the blockade was in place. And he was looking at the map that had the blockade line and the ships and the Soviet ships coming towards the blockade line, the destroyers and so on. And he said, to Anderson, what would you do if a Soviet ship tries to run the blockade? And Anderson said, we'd shoot first we'd hail them. And McNamara said, in what language? And Anderson said, well, how the hell do I know? Anderson didn't like McNamara much, and vice versa. And McNamara said, is there a Russian speaker aboard each of these destroyers? Was there a Russian speaker aboard your destroyer?
I had one, actually.
You did have one, okay.
It wasn't probably real fluent, but
Yeah, probably wasn't fluent, but, and it was probably a Greek ship anyway, so. But, said, okay, so you hail them, and, well, what would you do if they didn't pay attention to the hailing? And he said, well, we'd fire a shot across the bow. And then what would you do? Well, we fire a shot at their rudder, and McNamara says, listen, this is a political activity. It is not a military activity. I don't want you starting any wars. And Anderson says to the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Secretary, the Navy has been running blockades since John Paul Jones, and why don't you go back to your office and let us do what we know how to do? And McNamara comes back and says, I don't care what John Paul Jones was going to do. I am telling you, you are not going to fire a single shot without my permission. And I would get permission from the president. And it was a very ugly moment. And,
And Anderson was fired and sent to Portugal.
and Anderson and McNamara, when he left, he was, he said to his second in command, he said, Anderson's finished, I've lost confidence in him. And he became an ambassador to Portugal. Now, I wish somebody would lose confidence in me and send me to Portugal as an ambassador. Yes, Regina.
My name is Regina. I'm a student of Dr. Sherwin's, and the U.S. has always been really blessed because we're kind of geologically protected from our enemies, and that they do want to come to us. They have to travel over a vast ocean. So I know that was kind of one of the things that was shocking about the Cuban Missile Crisis was that we had these nuclear weapons of an enemy that was right next door to us. So I just drawing a parallel to September 11th, where when the attacks happened, we were pretty shocked about that. And was there any kind of?
You mean December 7th?
9/11. Did I say something else?
You said December 11th.
And December 7th.
I thought you were talking about Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor too. It hasn't happened too many times. But was there a shift in American society or American attitude before you were a little bit more carefree to this could happen anytime? Just kind of, was there more fear in society afterwards, or did you kind of things kind of just go back to normal after the missile crisis?
So what were your...
I had trouble with that.
we went to Vietnam shortly after.
Yeah. I have no feelings that there was a sudden shock. Remember, we've been in the Cold War for 15 years, and there were all kinds of threats out there to the public. After all, if there weren't threats, where would these two guys be able to get a job?
I had a good education at UVA.
No, I think the top levels will say, whoa, but the public, no. I like to leave you students with what to me is a very important date in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I will give the date and then run, and you're on your own after that. October 1961. That's it.
Thanks.
Hmm?
We're talking about the Berlin crisis, yes?
No.
Okay, I just, my first exam.
Oh, okay. I will talk about it.
Can you give us a hint?
I can give you facts. I don't do hints. The Soviet Union's missile program, we were subjected to all kinds of threats. Missiles raining down on the Soviet Union, producing missiles like sausages, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S., being as it was, went into a panic and started several strategic weapons programs. He was involved in one of those programs that was started in the late 50s. Khrushchev was lying. They didn't have all those missiles. But what he thought was a saving grace is we had no way of knowing that he didn't have those. Then something came along. Imaging satellites.
Corona program.
Which first successful mission was in late 1960. In May of 1961, the U.S. drastically revised its national intelligence estimate on the Soviet programs. In October of that year, they revised it again and leaked to a newspaper the results of that, which in an article by Joe Ossoff, who was a famous correspondent at the time. And Ossoff's story said that the U.S. knows that the Soviets doesn't have much out there. And what they did have out there, they were putting in vulnerable missile sites that were not silos or anything like that, and in groups. So the Soviet, in the fall of 1961, completely revised their ICBM, Strategic Weapons Program. But that would take years before it would become operational. As Khrushchev said in his memoirs, he said in July of 1962, he got the bright idea, we'll make things less dangerous by putting missiles into Cuba. And that's where the Cuban Missile operation started. But the bad guys were those Americans who built by satellite. I think I spent 30 years in that business. But you see how that upset the apple cart, so to speak. And you can read, if you go back and look at Soviet press conferences and things like that, back in that period, you'll be able to see evidence of that.
Yeah, October is a very dangerous month. That was also in 57, Sputnik.
Yeah.
October 57, Sputnik. and
Sent,
so-
sent the U.S. in hysteria. They're way ahead.
Right. So we gotta keep our fingers crossed for another 2 weeks or something. Whatever that date is. Other questions? Yes, Ali. Identify yourself.
My name is Ali. I'm a student of Professor Sherwin's. So being in this class, reading different books about crisis and having panic attacks as my fellow students had, reading those narratives about how close we came. I think one of the situations that were most dangerous was the submarine. The Soviet submarines that were coming towards Cuba that were actually armed with nuclear warheads. And the situation where one of them was being chased by the U.S. Navy, and the captain ordered to have the warhead loaded. Now that we know that, how does, like, when you look back, the things we've so far learned in the last couple of decades, how does that change your thinking or make you reflect on the fact that you were there during that time?
I'm very glad I didn't know that. Had I known that, I would have been petrified. But I wasn't.
There were another set of nuclear weapons we didn't know about, and these were cruise missiles that were already in Cuba, and their assignment was, in case of an invasion, to fire these missiles at the ships coming in. We did not know, and did not know for 20 or 25 years afterward, that those missiles were nuclear equipped. So if we had started an invasion in Cuba, we would have had a nuclear war.
Not too long after my tour of duty on the Hank, I ended up on a nuclear-powered, nuclear weapon-equipped cruiser that had nuclear weapons in 2 different surface-to-air missile and an anti-submarine warfare missile. And I took great delight in my job as the nuclear weapons officer. And when the Crew Des Pac selected their nuclear weapons ship of the year, we got it. Now, you're looking at one of the few naval officers that was wounded by a surface-to-air nuclear weapon, because I had to take my inventory every 6 months. And to do that, we had to go down into the magazine, and I had a clipboard and a sound-powered phone, and I'd say, rotate the missile. And they rotated the missile, and I checked the serial number on it. I said, rotate the next missile, check the serial number. Okay, I'm done. And raised my head up a little too early. And those surfaces are, I mean, they're very sharp. I ended up in sick bay with a couple of stitches.
So we bring this conversation to a close with your reporting to sick bay having been attacked by a nuclear missile. Okay. Well, I want to thank each one of you, Bob, Garrett, Ray, for taking the time to come and share your stories with us. It was really great, and certainly appreciate it. And I want to thank the audience for coming and for your questions and your interest. refreshments and
Thank you.